December 25, 1944. The Philippine night was quiet, unnervingly so. A chill hung over the prison compound at Leyte, though it was not the kind of cold felt in Europe. It was tropical air, damp, heavy, filled with the faint hum of insects beyond the barbed wire. On the ground, shadows of exhausted men shifted against dim lantern light. They were soldiers once, the fierce warriors of the Imperial Japanese Army. Now, they were captives. Their uniforms, once crisp and marked with pride, hung in tatters. Their bodies were reduced to skin and bone. Their eyes carried both defiance and defeat. They had seen friends fall, empires collapse, and flags torn from their hands. For them, this night should have been just another in the long, humiliating chain of captivity. Yet what unfolded under that tropical moon was something that would leave them shaken in ways no bayonet, no shell, no bullet ever had. The American guards, tall silhouettes in their khaki, carried no menace tonight. Instead, they carried something else, crates. Not ammunition, not rations meant only for themselves, but boxes filled with bread, tins of fruit, and bottles carefully set aside. A phonograph had been wheeled out from the command hut, its metal horn gleaming faintly in the lantern glow. And then, almost impossibly, music spilled across the wire. Soft, crackling, distant, but unmistakable, the sound of Christmas carols. Inside the compound, hundreds of Japanese prisoners froze. Their instincts told them this was a trick, a cruel theater of psychological torment. These were the Americans, their sworn enemy. The men who had stormed beaches under fire, who had driven them from foxholes, who had shelled their ships until steel buckled and burned. And yet here, on this night, the enemy did not raise rifles. They raised candles. They spoke not with commands, but with gestures of invitation. The guards opened the gate, not to free the prisoners, but to allow a few of them, chosen representatives, to approach the tables now being set up in the middle of the yard. The flicker of candlelight illuminated faces gaunt and weary. Men who had once shouted "Bonsai" with fanatical devotion, now trembling as they reached for warm bread handed to them by the very soldiers they once sought to kill. For the Japanese, it was unthinkable. Their own command had drilled into them an image of Americans as ruthless, savage, and devoid of honor. Captivity itself was supposed to be a shame worse than death. To accept kindness from an enemy was dishonor multiplied. Yet their hunger gnawed at them, not just of the stomach but of the spirit. And as the first taste of food passed their lips, a wave of silence fell over the compound. It was not silence of suspicion, nor silence of hatred. It was silence of shock. The music played on. Silent night. The phonograph needle scratched and wavered, but the melody endured. Some of the American guards sang, voices low, carrying across the humid air. The prisoners did not sing back. Not yet. They stood listening, trying to comprehend the impossibility before them. Then something extraordinary happened. A few of the Japanese prisoners, weak, hesitant, began to hum. It was faint, barely audible, but it carried an unmistakable tune. They did not know English, but the carol had been heard before in distant ports, in whispered echoes of the West. The humming grew stronger. Others joined, and before long, the compound was filled with a fragile, almost surreal chorus, voices of enemies, blending across the divide. The American guards did not raise a hand to stop it. They did not mock, and they did not laugh. They let it swell, let it rise into the night sky. For one rare evening, war's brutal machinery seemed to pause. Steel helmets reflected candlelight instead of gunfire. The wire fence divided bodies but not voices, and still, beneath the surface, tension remained. Many of the Japanese prisoners stood stiff, torn between instinct and emotion. Their code demanded resistance. Their hearts demanded survival. And yet, as they watched their comrades hum a Western hymn beside their captors, some felt the sting of tears burning their eyes. Not because of defeat, not because of shame, but because, for the first time in years, they felt the ghost of humanity returned. It was not the battlefield that broke them. It was this night, this holiday. This contradiction is too great to reconcile. Men who had been ready to die for the emperor found themselves overwhelmed by the simple act of being allowed to celebrate. Even in silence, even under guard, across the compound. One prisoner clutched his ragged sleeve where once an armband had shown his unit. He thought of the last winter in Manchuria, snow falling over frozen trenches. Another remembered the caves of Saipan, where comrades had thrown themselves into darkness rather than surrender. Now, both of them stood here, hearing the enemy sing songs not of war, but of peace. The lanterns flickered. The bread was shared. A bottle of warm, sweet liquid, apple cider, watered down, yet still intoxicating in its symbolism, was passed from guard to prisoner. They drank not as victors and vanquished, but as men trapped in the same night. Later, when the candles burned low and the phonograph sputtered to silence, the prisoners were led back behind the wire. The gates closed once more. The war resumed in the morning. The guns would thunder again, men would die again, and empires would collapse again. But for one fleeting night in the jungle of Leyte, something else had happened. Something no doctrine, no code of honor, and no propaganda could explain. The Japanese POWs lay awake on the hard ground, restless, haunted not by memories of combat, but by the kindness of their enemies. They whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile it. Some called it weakness. Others called it hypocrisy. But deep down, in the private recesses of their thoughts, they knew it for what it was. A mercy. A mercy so foreign, so impossible, that it would shake them for the rest of their days. That night became a legend in hushed tones, passed from one prisoner to another, and later carried back across the sea to a homeland scarred by firebombs and surrender. They could not understand it. They could not forget it. And in the darkness, under the weight of barbed wire and defeat, one undeniable truth began to take root. Sometimes the greatest weapon an enemy could wield was not steel, nor fire, nor fear, but compassion. By late 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most punishing phase. The Japanese Empire, once ascendant across Asia and the Pacific, was crumbling under the relentless advance of Allied forces. The Philippines, seized by Japan in 1942 after the brutal fall of Bataan and Corregidor, had become the centerpiece of America's return. General Douglas MacArthur had kept his promise, "I shall return," and with him came the grinding machinery of an industrial giant bent on dismantling the empire that had dared to challenge it. For the Japanese soldiers captured in these campaigns, captivity was a fate they had never been trained to accept. The Bushido Code, enshrined by the Imperial Japanese Army, framed surrender as worse than death. Soldiers were expected to die fighting, to launch banzai charges even when hopeless, or to commit seppuku rather than fall into enemy hands. Japanese propaganda told its men that Americans were monsters, soulless, merciless, and waiting to torture and humiliate any who surrendered. It was a narrative designed to harden resolve, to eliminate the very concept of capitulation. And yet, by 1944, the harsh arithmetic of war had made prisoners of thousands. American camps across the Pacific began filling with these reluctant captives. Some had been pulled from foxholes after collapsing from starvation. Others had been dragged wounded from jungle hiding places. Still others, too weak to resist, had simply laid down arms. Many arrived expecting death at the hands of their captors. Instead, they found something far stranger: order, rations, and guards who treated them not as vermin, but as defeated soldiers under control. This was not compassion in the sentimental sense. It was policy. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, pledging humane treatment of prisoners of war. Unlike Imperial Japan, which rejected those rules and subjected Allied POWs to starvation and brutality in camps like Changi, Fukuoka, and the Burma Railway, America sought to maintain an image of legitimacy. For the United States, proper treatment of captives was both a moral obligation and a strategic weapon. Every Japanese prisoner who returned home after the war would carry memories that could tarnish or bolster America's reputation. But there was more than law at work. American culture itself infused the camps with a different spirit. Many of the guards assigned to POW duty were young men from farms and towns who understood war's toll but had not lost their humanity in it. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also fathers, brothers, and sons. Christmas meant something to them, even half a world away. And in their eyes, extending a fraction of that meaning to their prisoners was not weakness. It was an assertion of values that contrasted sharply with the ruthless militarism their captives had been taught. The Japanese, of course, could not have known this at first. For them, each day in captivity was a struggle to reconcile reality with indoctrination. The guards did not beat them without reason. They did not starve them for amusement. They did not mock their emperor. Instead, they gave them rice, issued blankets, and allowed them to work. It was survival, something they had expected to lose the moment they surrendered. Yet even within this fragile existence, the cultural gulf was immense. The prisoners were haunted by shame. In their homeland, their families might already assume them dead. Should news of their capture ever spread, disgrace would shadow their names forever. Some considered suicide within the camps, unable to reconcile honor with survival. Others clung to the hope that enduring captivity might one day allow them to serve Japan again, even if only in rebuilding. Into this turbulent mix came the holiday of Christmas, a day meaningless in the Shinto and Buddhist traditions of Japan, yet profoundly sacred to the men guarding them. The Americans did not see the camp only as a place of control, but as a stage for demonstrating ideals. When Christmas approached in 1944, many of the guards sought to mark it, even far from home. They pooled rations, requested supplies, and scavenged for anything that could approximate a holiday. The idea was not merely to lift their own spirits. It was also to send a message, one the prisoners could not mistake. We are not like the empire you served. We fight with steel, but we also live by something beyond it. For the Japanese, this was bewildering. Their own command would never have permitted such indulgence. War was total, merciless, and absolute. To show kindness to an enemy was folly. To share food was treachery. Yet as the preparations unfolded, they watched, suspicious but curious. They saw guards string lanterns, heard rumors off music, and smelled the faint aroma of food that was not the usual watery rice. Whispers spread through the compound. Something was happening, something impossible, and in that anticipation lay the seeds of shock. Because when the night came, when the phonograph played its carols and the bread was passed through wire, the Japanese saw with their own eyes the chasm between what they had been told and what they now experienced. Their captors were not the monsters of propaganda. They were men, bound by traditions of their own, capable of mercy in the very heart of war. This clash between expectation and reality would echo long after that single Christmas night. For the Japanese prisoners, it became a moment of profound dissonance, proof that the enemy could be both ruthless in battle and merciful in victory. For the Americans, it was a quiet assertion that war need not extinguish humanity. And for history, it was a glimpse of how values, not just weapons, shaped the outcome of wars. The Philippines campaign raged on beyond the camp fences. Battles for Leyte and Luzon consumed tens of thousands of lives. Japanese troops still fought to the death in the mountains and jungles. American forces pressed relentlessly forward, drawing ever closer to the Japanese homeland. But inside the wire, on that single night of December 25, 1944, the war paused just long enough to expose a truth as enduring as any victory. That even in the darkest chapters of conflict, humanity can carve its own space, unexpected and unforgettable. The secret advantage was not forged in steel, nor hidden in the barrels of artillery, nor concealed beneath camouflage netting in the jungle. It was something far simpler, and yet far more devastating to the worldview of the Imperial Japanese Army. The Americans treated their prisoners like human beings. For men indoctrinated from their first day in uniform to believe the enemy was a beast, this reality struck harder than any shell burst. It dismantled a lifetime of propaganda in a single night of bread, music, and light. From the moment they enlisted, Japanese soldiers were conditioned to see mercy as weakness. In their manuals, Americans were described as materialistic cowards, slaves to comfort, and incapable of endurance. Captivity at American hands, they were told, would mean torture and humiliation, the stripping away of dignity until suicide became the only honorable escape. This narrative was hammered into them not just by officers, but by the state itself. Schoolchildren grew up with tales of foreign barbarism. Soldiers entered battle certain that death was preferable to falling into such hands. That belief had fueled the fanatic bonsai charges at Guadalcanal and the suicides on Saipan's cliffs. Yet the men who now sat in American camps found themselves confronted with a contradiction. The guards who watched them were stern, yes, but not cruel. They enforced rules, but they did not strike without reason. They carried rifles, but they also handed out rations. And on Christmas night in 1944, they did something that shattered all certainty. They invited the very men they had fought, killed, and captured into the rituals of their own holiday. To the prisoners, it was as if the world itself had tilted. The enemy had shown kindness where none was expected. The power of that moment was magnified by the cultural gulf between them. For Americans, Christmas was universal. It was warmth, family, and the sound of hymns echoing across snowy streets back home. To share it, even in the mud of a prison camp, was natural. But to the Japanese, the very act of sharing something sacred with the enemy was incomprehensible. Their army would never have done the same. To show kindness to a captured foe was to dishonor the emperor. And so, when their captors extended this gesture, the shock was twofold. The act itself and the realization of what it revealed about the Americans. This hidden advantage, the use of compassion as a weapon of dissonance, struck deep into the minds of the prisoners. On the battlefield, American superiority in numbers, firepower, and logistics was plain. In the skies, B-29s rained destruction on Japanese cities. On the seas, carriers and submarines strangled Japan's supply lines. But here, in the quiet of a camp far from the front, the Americans displayed something else: the ability to undermine the very foundations of enemy belief. By offering mercy, they attacked not bodies but convictions. German prisoners in Europe had experienced something similar, but for the Japanese it was far more profound. Their doctrine had no room for kindness. To them, surrender was a permanent stain. Yet the Americans, by giving food, music, and even respect, turned captivity into something that gnawed at the prisoners' very identity. Was the enemy truly the barbarian their officers had described? Or had they been lied to, sacrificed to a vision of war that blinded them to reality? The American guards did not speak this truth aloud. They did not need to. The simple contrast between what the prisoners had expected and what they experienced became the most powerful message of all. Every loaf of bread, every tin offrit, and every song drifting through the wire was a reminder. The world was larger than the empire's propaganda. And that knowledge, once planted, could not be erased. For some prisoners, this revelation became unbearable. Their shame deepened. To have fought and lost was one humiliation. To be shown kindness by the enemy was another. They wrestled with the realization that their own side would never have granted such mercy. Others, however, found in it a strange comfort. If survival meant enduring captivity, perhaps there was no dishonor in accepting food or in humming along to a carol sung by those once considered demons that I in this way. The Americans had uncovered an advantage that no tank or bomber could replicate. They wielded humanity as a weapon, deliberate or not, and in doing so, destabilized the prisoners' very sense of what war meant. This was not weakness. It was strength of a different kind. It was the strength to hold fast to values even in the heart-off brutality, and to use those values to unsettle an enemy who had built his identity on their supposed absence. That Christmas night, the shock of mercy spread like a contagion through the Japanese POWs. They whispered about it long after the lanterns were doused. Some dismissed it as a trick, a temporary deception. Others, silently, believed it to be genuine. In either case, it changed them. For no matter what they told themselves, they could never again see the Americans solely as monsters. And in a war built as much on ideology as on steel, that shift in perception was an advantage as decisive as any weapon forged in Detroit or Pittsburgh. The guards may not have realized it fully, but they had pierced the armor of the enemy's spirit. And once pierced, it could never be sealed again. The details of this hidden advantage were not written in battle reports or stamped into steel plates. They were woven into policy, culture, and the very mechanisms of American wartime organization. To understand why Japanese prisoners of war found themselves treated in ways so alien to their expectations, one must step beyond the wire and into the structures that shaped the camps themselves. It was here, in the intersection of law, logistics, and culture, that America revealed its quiet but devastating edge. At the heart of it lay the Geneva Convention of 1929. The United States, unlike Imperial Japan, had signed and ratified its principles. The agreement mandated humane treatment of captured soldiers, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. It prohibited reprisals, torture, and arbitrary executions. For the Americans, adherence to these rules was not only a matter of legal commitment, but also a deliberate assertion of moral authority. They fought a total war, but they sought to fight it under a code that would distinguish them from the very regimes they opposed. Implementing such standards required an immense logistical effort. Camps across the Pacific were supplied not haphazardly, but through structured chains of command. In Leyte, for example, supply officers ensured that POWs received rations from the same depots that fed U.S. troops: rice, tinned meat, powdered milk, and even bread when possible. Though prisoners always ate less and later than guards, the contrast with their own army's starvation policies toward Allied captives was stark. Where Japanese-run camps offered a bowl of watery gruel, American camps provided meals sufficient to sustain life. The shelters, too, reflected this discipline. Barbed wire and guard towers reminded the prisoners of their captivity, yet within the fences stood barracks with wooden bunks, blankets, and basic sanitation. Latrines were dug, water supplies maintained, and diseases monitored. The system was imperfect, often stretched thin by the vast scale of the war, but the principle remained. Prisoners were not left to rot. They were managed, cataloged, and cared for within the limits of American capacity. This infrastructure extended to communication. Red Cross representatives inspected camps when possible, carrying reports back to Washington and Geneva. Prisoners were allowed, on occasion, to send and receive letters, a small lifeline of ink and paper that reached across the ocean to families in Japan. Though heavily censored, these notes provided something vital: proof that the captured were still alive, that they remained men rather than vanished ghosts. To a soldier whose culture told him captivity erased his existence, even this was a revelation. Behind these policies stood more than law. American industry and culture reinforced them. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, for instance, brought not only radios to the battlefield, but also phonographs and film projectors to camps. Music and movies circulated among guards and, sometimes, filtered into prisoner life. On Christmas 1944, it was precisely such equipment, a hand-cranked phonograph and a stack of shellac records, that allowed carols to drift across the Leyte compound. What seemed spontaneous was, in fact, the byproduct of a vast logistical system that could deliver music to jungles as easily as ammunition. The guards themselves were part of this machinery. Drawn from units rotated off the front, they received instruction on handling prisoners. Many were told explicitly, "These men are no longer combatants. They are responsibilities." Training manuals outlined not only security measures, but also standards of conduct. Physical abuse was discouraged. Violations risked court-martial. For young Americans raised in communities where church sermons and civic duty intertwined, these rules aligned naturally with values already instilled. To enforce them was not an abstract obligation, but an extension of their identity. The contrast with Japanese doctrine was immense. The Imperial Japanese Army never ratified the Geneva Convention. Its field manual stressed the expendability of both enemies and subordinates. Prisoners were regarded as less than human, their existence an inconvenience. The infamous camps along the Burma-Thailand Railway, where Allied captives perished by the thousands under starvation and beatings, reflected this worldview. For Japanese soldiers who had witnessed or heard of such cruelty, the American camps were a mirror held up to their own nation's brutality, a mirror that reflected back something they could barely comprehend. Even in numbers, the difference was telling. By war's end, the United States held nearly 50,000 Japanese POWs in camps across the Pacific, Hawaii, and even the mainland. Each was processed, given a serial number, photographed, and placed within a system that, however harsh, recognized their existence. By contrast, countless Allied captives in Japanese hands simply disappeared, unrecorded, unmarked, consumed by neglect and cruelty. Technology amplified these differences. American supply ships could carry not only food and arms, but also medical supplies and recreational materials. Factories back home produced vast quantities of everything from tinned peaches to cigarettes, some of which found their way into POW rations. The Japanese, crippled by blockade and shortages, could not even feed their own troops, let alone their captives. Thus, When Japanese POWs in Leyte bit into American bread on Christmas night, they tasted not only food but also the weight of an industrial system their empire could never match. Even the guards' decision to share their holiday was shaped by this abundance. They had enough to spare. A crate of bread, a few tins of fruit, a phonograph record. These were luxuries born of a nation whose factories roared day and night, whose ships plied the oceans, whose resources seemed inexhaustible. To men from an island nation starving under blockade, such generosity was incomprehensible. It spoke not only of mercy but also of power. Thus the hidden advantage was layered. It was law and logistics, morality and machinery, and culture and capacity. It was the ability to wage war ferociously while still upholding standards of humanity. To the prisoners, it was dissonance incarnate. They had been told America was soft, decadent, and incapable of sacrifice. Yet here was an enemy whose factories outproduced theirs 100-fold, whose soldiers fought with relentless courage, and whose guards could offer bread and music even to those sworn to kill them. This technical and cultural infrastructure of rations, barracks, letters, and music was the scaffolding upon which that Christmas night in 1944 was built. Without it, the act would have been impossible. With it, the Americans demonstrated that their greatest strength was not only in tanks or planes, but in a system that could humanize even its enemies. And for the Japanese POWs, that realization cut deeper than any weapon fired on the battlefield. December 25th, 1944, was not the first time war had paused for humanity, nor would it be the last. But in the humid night of Leyte, it took on a particular sharpness, for here the clash between propaganda and reality was absolute. To fully grasp the impact, one must walk step by step through that evening, tracing it as though it were a battle, not of guns, but of perceptions. For in the minds of those prisoners, the Christmas celebration was a campaign as decisive as any fought on the ridges of Luzon or in the jungles of Guadalcanal. The camp's daily rhythm was predictable. Prisoners rose at dawn, were counted by guards, shuffled to work details, and returned before nightfall. Meals were issued with mechanical regularity. Rice, perhaps fish, often little more than enough to keep men alive. But on that Christmas day, small deviations began. The guards were less hurried, less severe. The compound seemed quieter. Whispers began circulating. Crates had arrived not for the guards' mess, but for something else. A phonograph had been carried in. Lanterns had been hung higher, throwing long shadows across the compound. For the prisoners, trained to expect the unexpected blow of cruelty, suspicion grew. Was this the prelude to humiliation? As darkness fell, the scene transformed. A table was dragged into the open yard, lit by candles and lanterns. Onto it, the guards placed loaves of bread, tins of preserved fruit, and bottles that glinted faintly. To men who had not seen such food in years, the sight was staggering. Bread, white, soft, foreign bread, was a rarity even in peacetime Japan, let alone in war's final desperate years. Canned peaches, their syrup gleaming in the flicker of light, wherein unimaginable luxury. The prisoners stared, hollow-eyed, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. Then came the music. The scratch of a phonograph needle gave way to the haunting melody of Silent Night. The sound was faint, distorted, yet unmistakable. For Americans, it was a song of home. For Japanese prisoners, it was alien, a hymn from another world. And yet its gentleness carried across language and culture. Guards began humming, then singing. Their voices, raw and unpolished, filled the camp with a sense of belonging to something beyond the jungle, beyond the war. The guards motioned to the prisoners. Not all. Only a few were permitted to step forward, carefully chosen by rank or lot. They approached hesitantly, gaunt figures in tattered uniforms. When the first piece of bread was handed across, it was done not with mockery, but with solemnity. The prisoner took it, trembling, as though fearing it might be snatched away. But it was not. He ate. Others followed. Tins were opened. Fruit was shared. Cups were filled with diluted cider. In those moments, a transformation occurred. The guards, once distant figures of authority, became something else. Men sharing a ritual older than the war itself. The prisoners, once mere captives, became participants. They did not forget the wire that caged them, nor the rifles that stood ready. But for a fleeting time, they were drawn into a world where enemies could stand together under candlelight. Reports from similar camps suggest that in some places, prisoners even attempted to sing along. The Japanese words did not exist, but the melody was universal. A few hummed, soft at first, then louder, until the compound echoed with the fragile harmony of voices on both sides of the wire. It was not a choir. It was not polished, but it was human. And in that shared sound, the walls of propaganda cracked. Not all embraced it. Some prisoners stood rigid, refusing even to taste the bread. Their pride would not allow it. To accept kindness was to accept shame. To participate was to admit defeat, not just of arms, but of spirit. They turned their backs, staring into the darkness, clinging to the emperor's image in their minds. But even they could not block out the sound of carols drifting across the compound, nor the sight of comrades wiping tears as they swallowed food given freely by their captors. The Americans, too, felt the weight of the moment. Many had fought bitter battles only weeks earlier and had watched friends die under Japanese fire. Some had seen the cruelty inflicted on Allied prisoners. Yet here they were, passing bread to men who might once have tried to kill them. The act was not without its own tension. But for those guards, the holiday carried meaning deeper than vengeance. To share it was to reclaim a piece of home, to assert that even in war, they remained connected to something beyond destruction. The night unfolded slowly, almost reverently. The food was consumed, the cider passed, and the songs played. No one raised a weapon. No one broke the fragile truce. At last, as candles guttered low and the phonograph clicked silent, the guards gestured for the prisoners to return to their barracks. They obeyed, moving quietly, carrying with them not only the taste of food but also the weight of an experience they could scarcely comprehend. Later, in whispers through the darkness, they tried to make sense of it. Some argued it was a strategy, a manipulation to soften their will. Others believed it was a genuine act of humanity. Many simply could not reconcile it at all. But whatever they told themselves, the memory remained, seared into their minds. They had seen their enemy not as a monster, but as men capable of mercy. And for a soldier raised to believe mercy was weakness, that knowledge was a wound deeper than any bullet. The next day, the war resumed its rhythm. The guards returned to their stern routines. Work details marched out. The rifles gleamed once more in the sun. But the memory of that night lingered. For the Americans, it was a brief escape, a reminder of home. For the Japanese prisoners, it was something else entirely, a fracture in the wall of belief, a moment when the war they thought they knew revealed a face they had never imagined. The Christmas celebration at Leyte was not recorded in the grand annals of strategy or the ledgers of logistics. But in the quiet testimonies of prisoners who survived, it endured as a decisive moment, proof that victory could be claimed not only on battlefields but also in hearts. And in the silence that followed, one truth was inescapable. Sometimes the most powerful act of war is not destruction, but the refusal to abandon humanity. The story of Christmas night at Leyte cannot be measured only in candles and bread. To understand its true weight, one must look into the minds of those Japanese prisoners, men who had been molded by years of indoctrination. The Imperial Japanese Army was not merely a fighting force. It was a machine designed to erase individuality, to weld men into weapons of the emperor's will. From their earliest training, recruits were taught that surrender was not an option. To die for Japan was not just honorable, it was expected. To live in captivity was the greatest possible disgrace. Every broadcast, every pamphlet, and every speech reinforced that truth. And yet here they were, not dead, not disgraced, but eating foreign bread beneath lantern light while listening to foreign music. The contradiction was staggering. Psychologists studying the Pacific War often speak of cognitive dissonance, the unbearable tension between belief and experience. For the Japanese prisoners of war, that dissonance was a constant torment. They had believed Americans were barbarians, less than human, devils in uniform. They had believed capture meant torture, starvation, and degradation until death. Many entered the wire prepared to be beaten or executed. But what they experienced was not torture. It was rationed food, regulated labor, and now, on Christmas night, an act of compassion so profound it could not be reconciled with everything they had been taught. The effect was not immediate collapse. Indoctrination does not vanish overnight. Instead, it cracked slowly, like ice under pressure. Some prisoners clung desperately to their beliefs, refusing to eat, refusing to look their captors in the eye. They repeated the emperor's name in whispers, trying to block out the reality before them. But others could not resist. They tasted the bread, sweet and soft, so different from the rough rice balls they had lived on. They drank the cider, weak but warm, and something within them shifted. The seed of doubt had been planted. This was exactly what American intelligence hoped for. Though the celebration was framed as a gesture of goodwill, it was also psychological warfare of the most subtle kind. Victory in the Pacific was not only about destroying Japan's armies. It was about shattering the myth of the empire's invincibility. Every prisoner who returned to his barracks with questions in his heart was a small triumph. Every whispered conversation about the kindness of the enemy was a crack in the wall of fanaticism. The Americans knew that when those men were eventually repatriated, their stories could spread. And in war, stories were weapons. Yet this was not propaganda in the crude sense of leaflets and slogans. It was something deeper, something more insidious. When the guards handed bread across the table, they were not merely feeding hungry men. They were rewriting the story those men had lived by. The emperor's warriors were supposed to die before capture. They were supposed to believe America was merciless. But the bread said otherwise. The music said otherwise. The Christmas lights said otherwise. And no matter how loudly one shouted slogans in the morning, the memory of that night would linger. The Japanese soldiers who participated later described feeling torn in two. Some admitted to guilt for accepting food from the enemy, guilt for singing foreign songs. They felt as though they had betrayed Japan simply by surviving. Others admitted to gratitude, though it was spoken in whispers, for the first kindness shown to them since the war began. A few even confessed to confusion, saying they no longer knew what was true. That confusion was perhaps the most dangerous weapon of all, for it robbed them of certainty. For the Americans, the night revealed something about themselves as well. Many had entered the Pacific theater filled with hatred. They had seen the brutality of the Bataan Death March, heard of atrocities in Nanking, and fought in jungles where surrender was rare and mercy rarer still. Yet on that Christmas night, they discovered a different kind of victory, not the annihilation of an enemy, but the transformation of one. The act of sharing food, of sharing song, was not weakness but strength. It proved they could hold on to their humanity even in the midst of savagery. That realization hardened their resolve. They were not merely fighting to defeat Japan. They were fighting to preserve a way of life that included mercy. Of course, the war outside the wire did not pause. In the Philippines, battles raged. In the skies, bombers droned toward targets. On distant seas, ships clashed. And in Tokyo, leaders plotted desperate last stands. Yet within the bamboo fences of Leyte, the psychological battlefield had shifted. The Americans had shown that they could win not only by force of arms but also by force of spirit. The prisoners had glimpsed a world beyond the emperor's commands. It was fleeting and fragile, but it was real. The aftermath of that night rippled outward in subtle ways. Some prisoners became more compliant and less resistant. They worked with fewer outbursts of defiance. Others began asking questions during interrogations, betraying slivers of information they would once have guarded with their lives. A few, perhaps most importantly, began to imagine a future after the war, something their indoctrination had never allowed. And when a soldier begins to imagine survival, he is no longer the same weapon he once was. Thus, the Christmas celebration became more than a gesture. It was a campaign in miniature, fought not with artillery, but with bread, not with bullets, but with song. It demonstrated the power of culture as a weapon and the ability of traditions to bridge even the deepest divides. And it revealed a truth as old as war itself. The human spirit, when wielded with purpose, can be sharper than any blade. In the words of one American officer who later reflected on the event. We wanted to show them that we were not the monsters they had been told we were. We wanted them to go back one day and say, I was their prisoner, and yet they treated me as a man. That was our victory. The Japanese prisoners did not forget. Some buried the memory deep, ashamed to admit it. Others carried it openly, retelling it in hushed tones. Years later, when the war was over and men returned home, the story surfaced again, told in memoirs, in testimonies, and in recollections of a night when war paused and something else took its place. The war ended not with a final charge of bayonets, but with silence, ash, and surrender. In August 1945, Japan bowed beneath the weight of fire and famine, and its soldiers, those who had once sworn never to be captured, were now scattered in camps across the Pacific and Asia. Among them were men who remembered a strange night in a prison compound on Leyte. For them, the war's end was not only about defeat, but also about the memory of mercy. When they returned to Japan, gaunt and hollow-eyed, they carried with them fragments of that Christmas evening. Some told their families quietly, "The Americans did not kill us. They gave us bread." In a nation where propaganda had painted the enemy as monsters, these words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples outward that would last for decades. Historians now argue that such moments, small, human, almost invisible in the shadow of great battles, were as important to shaping the post-war world as any tank engagement or naval bombardment. They were the seeds of reconciliation. They softened the ground for peace, proving that even in the furnace of total war, empathy had not been extinguished. When Japan rebuilt, when it became an ally instead of an adversary, when former enemies stood shoulder to shoulder in Korea and beyond, the memory of such moments helped bridge what had once been an unthinkable divide. For the Americans who had guarded the camps, the lesson was equally enduring. They had discovered that the true measure of victory was not simply in the destruction of the enemy's armies, but in the preservation of their own humanity. They had fought men who refused to surrender, who had been taught that compassion was weakness and that mercy was betrayal. And yet, by offering it anyway, by daring to treat prisoners as men and not as beasts, the Americans proved the strength of their ideals. It was not a tactical decision, not a maneuver of artillery or armor. It was a choice rooted in belief. Belief that war did not erase dignity. Belief that peace could be built even before the guns fell silent. The Japanese prisoners, too, carried the weight of that paradox. They had been trained to die for the emperor, yet they had lived. They had expected cruelty, yet they received kindness. In time, many would confess that those experiences left them conflicted, even ashamed. But they also admitted something else, that the mercy they received forced them to confront the limits of their own indoctrination. It was one thing to hate an enemy you never knew. It was another to share food with him, to hear his music, to glimpse his humanity. The legacy of that Christmas night is not found in official communiques or battle maps. It exists in memory, in testimony, in the quiet recollections of men who once stood on opposite sides of a vast chasm. It endures in the way post-war Japan and the United States, once bitter foes, became partners in shaping the new world order. The arc from Leyte to Tokyo Bay, from surrender to alliance, is long and complex. But within it are countless small threads, woven by acts of mercy, by moments of connection that defied the logic of war. Today, when historians speak of the Pacific War, they speak of Guadalcanal, Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the great battles that turned the tide. But somewhere in that story, less remembered but no less profound, is the night when Japanese prisoners could not believe their guards allowed them to celebrate Christmas. A night when lanterns glowed, when music drifted across bamboo fences, when bread was broken between enemies. A night when, for a brief moment, war gave way to something older, something deeper, the recognition of shared humanity. This was not sentimentality. It was strategy, it was psychology, it was survival. But it was also something more. It was proof that in modern war, as in all wars, the fiercest weapon is not always the one forged in steel. Sometimes it is the weapon forged in compassion. For while steel can destroy, compassion can transform. And in the end, transformation is the foundation of lasting peace. Field Marshal Keitel once admitted, bitterly, that Germany had built the better tanks but lost to an enemy that fought as one. Japan, too, had built soldiers who could endure, who could sacrifice, and who could die. But America had built something else, an army that could win without losing its soul. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The lesson lingers still. In every conflict since, from Korea to the deserts of the Middle East, commanders have wrestled with the same truth. War is not only about destroying an enemy's capacity to fight. It is about shaping the peace that follows. How one treats the defeated matters. How one remembers them matters. For when the guns fall silent, what remains are not only ruins and treaties, but also stories. Stories of cruelty. Stories of mercy. Stories of bread shared beneath a Christmas sky. And so the tale of Leyte's prisoners is not merely a footnote in the Pacific War. It is a reminder that humanity, even in its darkest hours, can flicker into light. That mercy, offered in defiance of hatred, can echo longer than any victory won by force. That the truest strength is not in crushing an enemy, but in proving to him that there is another way to live. The Japanese prisoners never forgot that night, nor did the Americans. And as long as their memories endure, the world is left with a lesson as urgent today as it was in 1944. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and compassion can defeat hatred. When armies fight with humanity intact, they are not merely victors in battle, they are builders of peace.